Part 8 1. Nearly 2 months had gone by. It was already the middle of the hot summer, and Sergei Ivanovich was only now preparing to leave Moscow. During that time, Sergei Ivanovich had his own events going on in his life. His book, the fruit of 6 years of toil, entitled An Essay and Survey of the Principles and Forms of Statehood in Europe and Russia, had been finished a year ago. Some sections of the book and the introduction had been printed in periodical publications, and other parts had been read by Sergei Ivanovich to people of his circle, so that the ideas of the work could no longer be quite new to the public. But all the same, Sergei Ivanovich expected the appearance of the book to make a serious impression in society and cause, if not a revolution in scholarship, at least a great stir in the scholarly world. This book, after careful polishing, had been published last year and sent out to the booksellers. Asking no one about it, responding with reluctance and feigned indifference to his friends' questions about how the book was doing, not even asking the booksellers how the sales were, Sergei Ivanovich watched keenly and with strained attention for the first impression his book would make in society and in literature. But a week went by, a second, a third, and there was no noticeable impression in society. His friends, the specialists and scholars, sometimes mentioned it, evidently out of politeness. But his other acquaintances, not interested in a book of learned content, did not speak to him about it at all. And in society, which especially now was busy with other things, there was complete indifference. In literature, too, for a whole month there was not a word about the book. Sergei Ivanovich calculated in detail the time needed to write a review, but a month went by, then another, and there was the same silence. Only in the Northern Beetle, in a humorous feuilleton about the singer Drabanti, who had lost his voice, were a few scornful words said in passing about Koznichev's book, indicating that it had long since been condemned by all and handed over to general derision. Finally, in the third month, a critical article appeared in a serious journal. Sergei Ivanovich knew the author of the article. He had met him once at Golubtsov's. The author was a very young and sickly Filtonist, quite pert as a writer, but with extremely little education and timid in his personal relations. Despite his complete contempt for the author, Sergei Ivanovich set about with complete respect to read the article. The article was terrible. The Filtonist had obviously understood the whole book deliberately in a way in which it could not possibly be understood. But he had selected his quotations so cleverly that for those who had not read the book, and obviously almost no one had read it, it was completely clear that the whole book was nothing but a collection of high-flown words, which were also used inappropriately. This was indicated by question marks, and that the author of the book was a completely ignorant man. And it was also witty that Sergei Ivanovich would not have minded displaying such wit himself. That was the terrible thing. Despite the complete conscientiousness with which Sergei Ivanovich tested the correctness of the reviewer's arguments, he did not linger for a moment over the shortcomings and mistakes that were being ridiculed. It was too obvious that it had all been selected on purpose, but at once began involuntarily to recall in the smallest detail his meeting and conversation with the author of the article. Did I offend him in some way? Sergei Ivanovich asked himself, and remembering that, when they had met, he had corrected the young man in the use of a word that showed his ignorance, he found the explanation of the article's meaning. After this article came a dead silence, both printed and oral, about the book, and Sergei Ivanovich saw that his work of 6 years, elaborated with such love and effort, had gone by without leaving a trace. His situation was the more difficult because, once he finished the book, he no longer had the intellectual work that formerly had taken up the greater part of his time. Sergei Ivanovich was intelligent, educated, healthy, energetic, and did not know where to apply his energy. Conversations in drawing rooms, conferences, meetings, committees, wherever one could talk, took up part of his time, but as an inveterate city dweller, he did not allow himself to be totally consumed by talking, as his inexperienced brother did when he was in Moscow. He was still left with considerable leisure and mental force. Fortunately for him, at this most trying time of his book's failure, the questions of racial minorities, American Friends, famine in Samara, the Exposition, and Spiritism came to be replaced by the Slavic question, too, previously only smoldering in society, and Sergei Ivanovich, one of those who had previously raised this question, gave himself wholly to it. In the milieu to which Sergei Ivanovich belonged, nothing else was talked or written about at that time but the Slavic question and the Serbian war. All that an idle crowd usually does to kill time was now done for the benefit of the Slavs. Balls, concerts, dinners, speeches, ladies' dresses, beer, taverns, all bore witness to a sympathy with the Slavs. With much of what was said and written on this subject Sergei Ivanovich did not agree in detail. He saw that the Slavic question had become one of those fashionable fads which, supplanting one another, always serve as a subject of concern for society. He also saw that there were many people who concerned themselves with it for vain, self-interested purposes. He recognized that the newspapers printed a great many useless and exaggerated things with one aim, to draw attention to themselves and outshout the rest. He saw that in this general upsurge of society the ones who leaped to the forefront and shouted louder than the rest were all the failures and the aggrieved, commanders-in-chief without armies, ministers without ministries, journalists without journals, party chiefs without partisans. He saw that much here was frivolous and ridiculous, but he also saw and recognized the unquestionable, ever-growing enthusiasm which united all classes of society, with which one could not but sympathize. The slaughter of co-religionists and brother Slavs awakened sympathy for the sufferers and indignation against the oppressors. And the heroism of the Serbs and Montenegrins, fighting for a great cause, generated in the whole nation a desire to help their brothers not in word now but in deed. But with that came another phenomenon that made Sergei Ivanovich rejoice. This was the manifestation of public opinion. Society definitely expressed its wish. The nation's soul was given expression, as Sergei Ivanovich liked to put it. And the more involved he became in it, the more obvious it seemed to him that this was a cause that would attain vast proportions, that would mark an epoch. He devoted himself completely to the service of this great cause and forgot all about his book. His time was now wholly taken up, so that he was even unable to respond to all the letters and requests addressed to him. Having spent the entire spring and part of the summer working, it was only in the month of July that he decided to go to his brothers in the country. He was going for a 2-week rest in the very holy of holies of the people, the depths of the country, there to revel in the sight of that upsurge of popular spirit of which he and all the inhabitants of the capital and other cities were fully convinced. Katovisov, who had long wanted to fulfill his promise to visit Levine, went with him too. Sergei Ivanovich and Katovisov had only just driven up to the Kursk railway station, particularly alive with people that day, climbed out of the carriage, and looked round for the footman who was coming after them with the luggage. When the volunteers 3 arrived in 4 hired cabs, ladies with bouquets met them and, accompanied by the crowd that poured after them, they went into the station. One of the ladies who had met the volunteers addressed Sergei Ivanovich as she came out of the waiting room. "You've also come to see them off?" she asked in French. "No, princess, I'm traveling myself, for a rest at my brother's." "Do you always see them off?" Sergei Ivanovich said with a barely perceptible smile. "One couldn't possibly," replied the princess. "Is it true that we've already sent 800 men? Malvinsky didn't believe me. More than 800. If we count those who weren't sent directly from Moscow, it's over 1,000, said Sergei Ivanovich. "Well, there, just what I said." The lady agreed joyfully. "And it's true that nearly 1 million has been donated now?" "More, princess." "And how about today's telegram?" "The Turks have been beaten again." "Yes, I read it," replied Sergei Ivanovich. They were speaking of the latest telegram confirming that for 3 days in a row the Turks had been beaten at all points and had fled, and that the decisive battle was expected the following day. "Ah, yes, you know, there's a certain young man, a wonderful one, who wants to volunteer. I don't know why they made difficulties. I know him and wanted to ask you please to write a note. He's been sent from Countess Lydia Ivanovna." Having asked what details the princess knew about the volunteering young man, Sergei Ivanovich went to the first-class waiting room, wrote a note to the person on whom it depended, and gave it to the princess. "You know, Count Vronsky, the famous one, is going on this train," said the princess, with a triumphant and meaningful smile, when he found her again and handed her the note. "I heard he was going but didn't know when." "On this train, is it?" "I saw him. He's here." "His mother is the only one seeing him off." "All in all, it's the best thing he could do." "Oh, yes, of course." While they were talking, The crowd poured past them towards the dining table. They also moved there and heard the loud voice of one gentleman who, with a glass in his hand, delivered a speech to the volunteers. "Serve for the faith, for humanity, for our brothers," the gentleman spoke, constantly raising his voice. "Mother Moscow blesses you for a great deed, Zivio," he concluded loudly and tearfully. Everyone shouted Zivio, and another new crowd poured into the room, all but knocking the princess off her feet. "Ah, princess, how about all this?" said Stepan Arkadyevich, who suddenly appeared in the midst of the crowd, beaming with a joyful smile. He put it so nicely, so warmly, didn't he? Bravo! And Sergei Ivanitch, why don't you say something for your part? A few words, you know, an encouragement. You do it so well, he added with a gentle, respectful and cautious smile, pushing Sergei Ivanovitch lightly by the arm. "No, I'm just leaving." "Wherefore?" "The country, my brother's place," replied Sergei Ivanovitch. "You'll see my wife, then?" "I've written to her, but you'll see her before. Viva in Serbian. Please tell her you've seen me and it's all right. She'll understand. Anyhow, be so good as to tell her that I've been appointed a member of the Commission of the United. Well, she'll understand. You know, les petites misères de la vie humaine." He turned to the princess, as if an apology. "And Princess Myagki, not Liza but Bibish, is really sending 1,000 guns and 12 nurses. Did I tell you?" "Yes, I heard that," Koznishev said reluctantly. "It's a pity you're leaving," said Stepan Arkadyevich. "Tomorrow we're giving a dinner for 2 departing friends, Dimir Bartniansky from Petersburg, and our own Veselovsky, Grisha. They're both going. Veselovsky got married recently. A fine fellow." "Right, princess?" He turned to the lady. The princess, without replying, looked at Koznishev, but the fact that both Sergei Ivanovitch and the princess seemed to want to be rid of him did not embarrass Stepan Arkadyevich in the least. Smiling, he looked now at the feather in the princess's hat, now all around him, as if trying to remember something. Seeing a lady passing by with a cup, he called her over and put a 5-ruble note into it. "I can't look calmly at those cups as long as I've got money," he said. "And how do you like today's dispatch?" "Fine fellows, the Montenegrins." "You don't say so," he exclaimed, when the princess told him that Vronsky was going on this train. For a moment Stepan Arkadyevitch's face showed sadness, but a minute later, when, springing at each step and smoothing his side whiskers, he went into the room where Vronsky was, Stepan Arkadyevitch had already quite forgotten his desperate sobs over his sister's body and saw Vronsky only as a hero and an old friend. "With all his shortcomings it's impossible not to do him justice," said the princess to Sergei Ivanovitch, as soon as Oblonsky left them. "His is precisely a fully Russian, Slavic nature. Only I'm afraid Vronsky won't find it pleasant to see him." "Whatever you say, that man's fate moves me." "Talk to him on the way," said the princess. "Yes, maybe, if I have the chance. I never liked him. But this redeems a lot. He's not only going himself, but he's equipping a squadron at his own expense." "Yes, I heard." The bell rang. Everyone crowded towards the door. "There he is," said the princess, pointing to Vronsky, in a long coat. "The little miseries of human life." And wide-brimmed black hat, walking arm in arm with his mother. Oblonsky was walking beside him, saying something animatedly. Vronsky, frowning, was looking straight ahead of him, as if not hearing what Stepan Arkadyevitch was saying. Probably at Oblonsky's indication, he glanced over to where the princess and Sergei Ivanovitch were standing and silently raised his hat. His face, aged and full of suffering, seemed made of stone. Going out on the platform, Vronsky silently let his mother pass and disappeared into the carriage. From the platform came "God Save the Tsar," then shouts of hurrah. And Zivio, one of the volunteers, a tall and very young man with a sunken chest, bowed especially conspicuously, waving a felt hat and a bouquet over his head. From behind him, also bowing, peeped 2 officers and an older man with a big beard and a greasy peaked cap. 3. Having taken leave of the princess, Sergei Ivanovitch and Katovisov, who now rejoined him, got into the packed carriage together, and the train started. At the Tsaritsyn station 4, the train was met by a harmonious choir of young people singing "Glory Be." Again the volunteers bowed and stuck their heads out the windows, but Sergei Ivanovitch paid no attention to them. He had dealt with the volunteers so much that he knew their general type and it did not interest him. But Katovisov, busy with his learned occupations, had had no chance to observe the volunteers, was very interested in them and questioned Sergei Ivanovich about them. Sergei Ivanovich advised him to go to second class and talk with them himself. At the next station Kutavisov followed that advice. At the first stop he went to second class and made the acquaintance of the volunteers. They were sitting apart in a corner of the carriage, talking loudly, obviously aware that the attention of the passengers and of the entering Kutavisov was turned on them. The loudest talker of all was the young man with the sunken chest. He was obviously drunk and was recounting some episode that had happened at his school. Opposite him sat an officer, no longer young, wearing an Austrian military jacket from the uniform of the guards. He listened, smiling, to the narrator and kept interrupting him. The third, in an artillery uniform, sat on a suitcase next to them. The fourth was asleep. Getting into conversation with the young man, Kutavisov learned that he was a wealthy Moscow merchant who had squandered a large fortune before he was 22. Kutavisov disliked him for being pampered, spoiled, and of weak health. He was obviously convinced, especially now, after drinking, that he was performing a heroic deed, and he boasted in the most disagreeable manner. The second, the retired officer, also made an unpleasant impression on Kutavisov. One could see that this was a man who had tried everything. He had worked for the railway, and as a steward, and had started his own factory, and talked about it all using learned words needlessly and inappropriately. The third, the artilleryman, on the contrary, Kutavisov liked very much. He was a modest, quiet man, who obviously admired the knowledge of the retired guardsman and the heroic self-sacrifice of the merchant and did not say anything about himself. When Kutavisov asked him what had moved him to go to Serbia, he replied modestly, "Why, everybody's going. We must help the Serbs. It's a pity." "Yes, they're especially short of you artillerymen," said Kutavisov. "I didn't serve long in the artillery. Maybe they'll send me to the infantry or the cavalry." "Why the infantry when artillerymen are needed most of all?" said Kutavisov, calculating from the artilleryman's age that he must be of significant rank. "I didn't serve long in the artillery. I retired as a cadet," he said, and began to explain why he had not passed the examination. All this together made an unpleasant impression on Kutavisov. And when the volunteers got out at the station to have a drink, he wanted to talk with someone and share his unfavorable impression. One passenger, a little old man in a military overcoat, had been listening all the while to his conversation with the volunteers. Left alone with him, Kutavisov addressed him. "What a variety of situations among all the men going there," Kutavisov said vaguely, wishing to voice his opinion and at the same time to find out what the old man's opinion was. The old man was a soldier who had done 2 campaigns. He knew what it was to be a soldier, and from the look and talk of these gentlemen, from the dashing way they applied themselves to the flask as they went, he considered them poor soldiers. Besides, he lived in a provincial town and wanted to tell how a discharged soldier in his town had volunteered, a drunkard and a thief whom no one would even hire as a worker. But knowing from experience that, in the present mood of society, it was dangerous to express an opinion contrary to the general one, and particularly to denounce the volunteers, he also searched out Kutavisov. "Well, they need people there. I've heard the Serbian officers aren't any good." "Oh, yes, and these will make fine soldiers," Kutavisov said, laughing with his eyes. And they began to talk about the latest war news, each concealing from the other his perplexity as to whom the next day's battle was to be fought with. If, according to the latest news, the Turks had been beaten at all points. And so they parted, neither of them having voiced his opinion. Kutavisov went to his carriage and, involuntarily dissembling, told Sergei Ivanovich his observations on the volunteers, from which it turned out that they were excellent fellows. At a large town station the volunteers were again met with singing and shouting, again men and women appeared with collection cups, and the provincial ladies offered bouquets to the volunteers and followed them to the buffet, but all this was considerably weaker and smaller than in Moscow. 4. During the stop in the provincial capital Sergei Ivanovich did not go to the buffet but started pacing up and down the platform. The first time he walked past Vronsky's compartment, he noticed that the window was curtained. But, walking past it a second time, he saw the old countess at the window. She called him over to her. "You see, I'm accompanying him as far as Kursk," she said. "Yes, I heard," said Sergei Ivanovich, pausing by her window and looking inside. What a handsome gesture on his part, he added, noticing that Vronsky was not in the compartment. But after his misfortune, what was he to do? Such a terrible occurrence, said Sergei Ivanovich. Ah, what I've lived through. But do come in. Ah, what I've lived through, she repeated, when Sergei Ivanovich came in and sat down beside her on the seat. You can't imagine. For 6 weeks he didn't speak to anyone and ate only when I begged him to. And he couldn't be left alone for a single moment. We took away everything he might have used to kill himself. We lived on the ground floor, but we couldn't predict anything. You know, he already tried to shoot himself because of her, she said, and the old lady's brows knitted at the memory of it. Yes, she ended as such a woman should have ended. Even the death she chose was mean and low. It's not for us to judge, Countess, Sergei Ivanovich said with a sigh, but I understand how hard it was for you. Ah, don't even say it. I was living on my estate and he was with me. A note was brought to him. He wrote a reply and sent it back. We had no idea that she was right there at the station. In the evening I had just gone to my room when my Mary told me that some lady at the station had thrown herself under a train. It was as if something hit me. I knew it was she. The first thing I said was, don't tell him. But he had already been told. His coachman was there and saw it all. When I came running into his room, he was no longer himself. It was terrible to look at him. He galloped off to the station without saying a word. I don't know what happened there, but he was brought back like a dead man. I wouldn't have recognized him. Prostration complete, the doctor said. Then came near frenzy. Ah, what is there to say? The Countess went on, waving her hand. A terrible time. No, whatever you say, she was a bad woman. Well, what are these desperate passions? It's all to prove something special. So she proved it. Ruined herself and 2 fine men, her husband and my unfortunate son. And what about her husband? Asked Sergei Ivanovich. He took her daughter. At first Alyosha agreed to everything. But now he suffers terribly for having given his daughter to a stranger. But he can't go back on his word. Karenin came to the funeral. But we tried to make it so that he wouldn't meet Alyosha. For him, for the husband, it's easier after all. She set him free. But my poor son gave her all of himself. He abandoned everything, career, me, and even so she took no pity on him but deliberately destroyed him completely. No, whatever you say, her death was itself the death of a vile, irreligious woman. God forgive me, but I can't help hating her memory, looking at the ruin of my son. But how is he now? This is God's help to us, this Serbian war. I'm an old woman. I don't understand anything about it, but it's been sent him by God. Of course, as a mother I'm afraid, and above all they say ne patres bien vous apeters bor. But what can be done? It's the only thing that could have lifted him up again. Yashvine, his friend, lost everything at cards and decided to go to Serbia. He came to see him and talked him into it. Now he's taken up with it. Talk to him, please. I want him to be distracted. He's so sad. And, as ill luck would have it, he's got a toothache. He'll be very glad to see you. Please talk to him. He's walking on that side. Sergei Ivanovich said he would be very glad to, and went over to the other side of the train. 5. In the slanted evening shadow of the sacks piled on the platform, Vronsky, in his long coat, his hat pulled down over his eyes, his hands in his pockets, was pacing like a caged animal, turning abruptly every 20 steps. As Sergei Ivanovich approached, it seemed to him that Vronsky saw him but pretended to be unseeing. That made no difference to Sergei Ivanovich. He was above keeping any personal accounts with Vronsky. In Sergei Ivanovich's eyes, Vronsky was at that moment an important actor in a great cause, and he considered it his duty to encourage him and show his approval. He went up to him. Vronsky stopped, peered, recognized him and, taking a few steps towards him, gave him a very firm handshake. Perhaps you didn't wish to see me, said Sergei Ivanovich, but may I not be of some use to you? There is no one it would be less unpleasant for me to see than you, said Vronsky. Forgive me. Nothing in life is pleasant for me. I understand, and I wanted to offer you my services, said Sergei Ivanovich, peering into Vronsky's obviously suffering face. Might you need a letter to Ristish, or to Milan? 5. Oh, no, said Vronsky, as though he had difficulty understanding. If you don't mind, let's walk a bit more. It's so stuffy on the train. A letter? It's not very well regarded in Petersburg. No, Thank you. One needs no recommendations in order to die. Unless it's to the Turks, he said, smiling with his lips only. His eyes kept their expression of angry suffering. Yes, but perhaps it will be easier for you to enter into relations, which are necessary in any case, with someone who has been prepared. However, as you wish. I was very glad to hear of your decision. There are so many attacks on the volunteers that a man like you raises them in public opinion. As a man, said Vronsky, I'm good in that life has no value for me. And I have enough physical energy to hack my way into a square and either crush it or go down, that I know. I'm glad there's something for which I can give my life, which is not so much needless as hateful to me. It will be useful to somebody. And he made an impatient movement with his jaw, caused by an incessant, gnawing toothache, which even prevented him from speaking with the expression he would have liked. You'll come back to life, I predicted, said Sergei Ivanovich, feeling moved. Delivering one's brothers from the yoke is a goal worthy of both death and life. May God grant you outward success, and inner peace, he added and held out his hand. Vronsky firmly pressed Sergei Ivanovich's hand. Yes. As a tool I may prove good for something. But as a human being I am a wreck, he said measuredly. The nagging pain in the strong tooth, filling his mouth with saliva, prevented him from speaking. He fell silent, peering into the wheels of a tender rolling slowly and smoothly towards him on the rails. And suddenly a quite different feeling, not pain but a general, tormenting inner discomfort, made him forget his toothache for a moment. As he looked at the tender and the rails, influenced by the conversation with an acquaintance he had not met since his misfortune, he suddenly remembered her, that is, what was left of her when he came running like a madman into the shed of the railway station. On a table in the shed, sprawled shamelessly among strangers, lay the blood-covered body, still filled with recent life. The intact head with its heavy plaits and hair curling at the temples was thrown back, and on the lovely face with its half-open red lips a strange expression was frozen. Pitiful on the lips and terrible in the fixed, unclosed eyes, as if uttering the words of that terrible phrase, that he would regret it, which she had spoken to him when they had quarreled. And he tried to remember her as she had been when he first met her, also at a station, mysterious, enchanting, loving, seeking and giving happiness, and not cruelly vengeful as he remembered her in the last moment. He tried to remember his best moments with her, but those moments were forever poisoned. He remembered only her triumphant, accomplished threat of totally unnecessary but ineffaceable regret. He ceased to feel the toothache, and sobs distorted his face. After silently walking past the sacks a couple of times and regaining control of himself, he calmly addressed Sergei Ivanovich. Have you had any telegrams since yesterday's? Yes, they were beaten for a third time, but tomorrow the decisive battle is expected. And having talked more about Milan being proclaimed king and the enormous consequences it might have, they went back to their carriages after the second bell. 6. As he had not known when he would be able to leave Moscow, Sergei Ivanovich had not telegraphed his brother in order to be met. Levin was not at home when Kutavisov and Sergei Ivanovich, dusty as Moors, in a little tarantass hired at the station, drove up to the porch of the Pokrovsky house at around noon. Kitty, who was sitting on the balcony with her father and sister, recognized her brother-in-law and ran down to meet him. Shame on you for not letting us know, she said, giving Sergei Ivanovich her hand and offering her forehead. We had a wonderful ride, and without bothering you, replied Sergei Ivanovich. I'm so dusty I'm afraid to touch you. I've been so busy I didn't know when I'd be able to get away. And you, as ever, he said, smiling, are enjoying quiet happiness far from all the currents in your quiet backwater. And our friend Fyodor Vasilievich also finally decided to come. In them no Negro. I'll wash and look like a human being, Kutavisov said with his usual jocularity, giving her his hand and smiling, his teeth gleaming especially on account of his black face. Kostya will be very glad. He's gone out to the farmstead. He ought to be home any time now. Still busy with the farming, precisely in backwaters, said Kutavisov. And we in the city see nothing but the Serbian war. Well, what's my friend's attitude? Surely something unlike other people's? No, not really, the same as everyone else's, Kitty replied, looking with some embarrassment at Sergei Ivanovich. I'll send for him, then. And we have Papa with us. He came from abroad not long ago. And, giving orders that Levin be sent for and that her dust-covered guests be taken to wash, one to the study, the other to Dolly's former room, and that lunch be prepared for them. She ran out to the balcony, exercising her right to move quickly, which she had been deprived of during her pregnancy. "It's Sergei Ivanovich and Katovisov, a professor," she said. "Ah, it's hard in such heat," said the prince. "No, Papa, he's very nice, and Kostya loves him very much," said Kitty, smiling, as if persuading him of something, having noticed the mocking look on her father's face. "Oh, don't mind me. Go to them, darling," Kitty said to her sister, "and entertain them." They met Steva at the station. "He's well, and I'll run to Mitya." "Poor thing, I haven't nursed him since breakfast. He's awake now and must be crying." And, feeling the influx of milk, she went with quick steps to the nursery. Indeed, it was not that she guessed. Her bond with the baby had not been broken yet, but she knew for certain by the influx of milk in her that he needed to be fed. She knew he was crying even before she came near the nursery. And he was indeed crying. She heard his voice and quickened her pace. But the quicker she walked, the louder he cried. It was a good, healthy, but hungry and impatient voice. "Has he been crying long, Nanny?" Kitty said hurriedly, sitting down on a chair and preparing to nurse him. "Give him to me quickly." "Ah, Nanny, how tiresome you are." "No, you can tie the bonnet afterwards." The baby was in a fit of greedy screaming. "That's not the way, dearie," said Agafia Mikhailovna, who was almost always there in the nursery. "He must be tidied up properly." "Coo, coo," she sang over him, paying no attention to the mother. The nanny brought the baby to the mother. Agafia Mikhailovna followed them, her face melting with tenderness. "He knows me, he does. It's God's truth, dearest Katerina Alexandrovna. He recognized me." Agafia Mikhailovna outshouted the baby. But Kitty did not listen to what she said. Her impatience kept growing along with the baby's. Owing to that impatience, it was a long time before matters were put right. The baby grabbed the wrong thing and got angry. Finally, after a desperate, gasping cry and empty sucking, matters were put right. Mother and baby simultaneously felt pacified, and both quieted down. "He's all sweaty, too, poor little thing," Kitty said in a whisper, feeling the baby. "Why do you think he recognizes you?" she added, looking sideways at the baby's eyes, which seemed to her to be peeping slyly from under the pulled-down bonnet, at his regularly puffing cheeks and his hand with its red palm, with which he was making circular movements. "It can't be." "If he recognized anyone, it would be me," Kitty said in response to Agafia Mikhailovna's observation, and she smiled. She smiled because, though she had said he could not recognize anything, she knew in her heart that he not only recognized Agafia Mikhailovna but knew and understood everything, knew and understood much else that no one knew and which she, his mother, had herself learned and begun to understand only thanks to him. For Agafia Mikhailovna, for his nanny, for his grandfather, even for his father, Mitya was a living being who required only material care, but for his mother he had long been a moral creature with whom she had a whole history of spiritual relations. "Once he wakes up, God willing, you'll see for yourself. I do like this," and he just beams all over. "The darling beams all over, like a sunny day," said Agafia Mikhailovna. "Well, all right, we'll see then," whispered Kitty. "Go now, he's falling asleep." 7. Agafia Mikhailovna tiptoed out, the nanny lowered the blind, chased away the flies from under the muslin bed curtain and a hornet that was beating against the window pane, and sat down, waving a wilting birch branch over the mother and baby. "Ah, this heat, this heat. If only God would send a little rain," she said. Yes, shh, was Kitty's only reply, as she rocked slightly and gently pressed down the plump arm, as if tied with a thread at the wrist, which Mitya kept waving weakly, now closing, now opening his eyes. This arm disturbed Kitty. She would have liked to kiss it but was afraid to, lest she waken the baby. The little arm finally stopped moving and the eyes closed. Only from time to time, going on with what he was doing, the baby raised his long, curling eyelashes slightly and glanced at his mother with his moist eyes, which seemed black in the semi-darkness. The nanny stopped waving and dozed off. From upstairs came the rumble of the old prince's voice and Katovisov's loud laughter. "They must have struck up a conversation without me," thought Kitty. But all the same it's vexing that Kostya's not here. He must have gone to the apiary again, though it's sad that he goes there so often. I'm glad all the same. It diverts him. Now he's begun to be more cheerful and better than in the spring. Then he was so gloomy and tormented, I began to be frightened for him. What a funny man, she whispered, smiling. She knew what tormented her husband. It was his unbelief, although, if she had been asked whether she supposed that in the future life he would perish for his unbelief, she would have had to agree that he would. His unbelief did not make her unhappy, and while she acknowledged that there was no salvation for an unbeliever, and she loved her husband's soul more than anything in the world, she smiled as she thought about his unbelief and said to herself that he was funny. Why has he been reading all sorts of philosophies for a whole year? She thought. If it's all written in those books, then he can understand them. If it's not true, why read them? He says himself that he'd like to believe. Then why doesn't he believe? Probably because he thinks so much. And he thinks so much because of his solitude. Alone. Always alone. With us he can't talk about everything. I think he'll like having these guests, especially Katovisov. He likes discussing things with him, she thought, and at once turned her mind to where it would be best to put Katovisov, in a separate room, or together with Sergei Ivanovich. And here a thought suddenly came to her that made her start with agitation and even disturb Mitya, who gave her a stern look for it. I don't think the laundress has brought the washing yet, and the bed linen for guests has all been used. If I don't see to it, Agafia Mikhailovna will give Sergei Ivanovich unwashed linen. And the very thought of it brought the blood rushing to Kitty's face. Yes, I'll see to it, she decided and, going back to her previous thoughts, remembered that she had not finished thinking about something important, intimate, and she began to remember what it was. Yes, Kostya's an unbeliever, she remembered again with a smile. So, he's an unbeliever. Better let him stay that way than be like Madame Stahl, or like I want it to be that time abroad. No, he's not one to pretend. And a recent instance of his kindness appeared vividly to her. 2 weeks ago Dolly had received a repentant letter from Stepan Arkadyevich. He implored her to save his honor, to sell her estate in order to pay his debts. Dolly was in despair, hated her husband, despised him, pitied him, resolved to divorce him, to refuse him, but ended by agreeing to sell part of her estate. Then Kitty, with an involuntary smile of tenderness, remembered her husband's embarrassment, his several awkward approaches to the matter in question, and how, having thought up the one and only way of helping Dolly without insulting her, he had suggested that Kitty give up her part of the estate, something she had not thought of before. What kind of unbeliever is he? With his heart, with that fear of upsetting anyone, even a child. Everything for others, nothing for himself. Sergei Ivanovich simply thinks it's Kostya's duty to be his steward. His sister, too. Now Dolly and her children are in his care. And there are all these muziks who come to him every day as if it were his business to serve them. Yes, be just like your father, be just like him, she said, handing Mitya to the nanny and touching his cheek with her lips. 8. From that moment when, at the sight of his beloved brother dying, Levin had looked at the questions of life and death for the first time through those new convictions, as he called them, which imperceptibly, during the period from 20 to 34 years of age, had come to replace his childhood and adolescent beliefs. He had been horrified, not so much at death as at life without the slightest knowledge of whence it came, wherefore, why, and what it was. The organism, its decay, the indestructibility of matter, the law of the conservation of energy, development, were the words that had replaced his former faith. These words and the concepts connected with them were very well suited to intellectual purposes, but they gave nothing for life, and Levin suddenly felt himself in the position of a person who has traded his warm fur coat for muslin clothing and, caught in the cold for the first time, is convinced beyond question, not by reasoning but with his whole being, that he is as good as naked and must inevitably die a painful death. From that moment on, though not accounting for it to himself and continuing to live as before, Levin never ceased to feel that fear at his ignorance. Moreover, he felt vaguely that what he called his convictions were not only ignorance but were a way of thinking that made the knowledge he needed impossible. At first his marriage, the new joys and responsibilities he came to know, completely stifled these thoughts, but lately, after his wife gave birth, while he was living idly in Moscow, Levin began to be faced more and more often, more and more urgently, by this question that demanded an answer. The question for him consisted in the following: if I do not accept the answers that Christianity gives to the questions of my life, then which answers do I accept? And nowhere in the whole arsenal of his convictions was he able to find, not only any answers, but anything resembling an answer. He was in the position of a man looking for food in a toy maker's or a gunsmith's shop. Involuntarily, unconsciously, he now sought in every book, in every conversation, in every person, a connection with these questions and their resolution. What amazed and upset him most of all was that the majority of people of his age and circle, who had replaced their former beliefs, as he had, with the same new beliefs as he had, did not see anything wrong with it and were perfectly calm and content. So that, besides the main question, Levin was tormented by other questions. Are these people sincere? Are they not pretending? Or do they not understand somehow differently, more clearly, than he the answers science gives to the questions that concerned him? And he diligently studied both the opinions of these people and the books that expressed these answers. One thing he had discovered since he began to concern himself with these questions was that he had been mistaken in supposing, from memories of his youthful university circle, that religion had outlived its day and no longer existed. All the good people close to him were believers. The old prince, and Lvov, whom he had come to love so much, and Sergei Ivanovich, and all the women were believers, and his wife believed as he had believed in early childhood, and 99/100ths of all the Russian people, that people whose life inspired the greatest respect in him, were believers. Another thing was that, after reading many books, he became convinced that those who shared the same views with him saw nothing else implied in them and, without explaining anything, simply dismissed the questions which he felt he could not live without answering, and tried to resolve completely different questions, which could not be of interest to him, for instance, about the development of the organism, about the mechanical explanation of the soul, and so on. Besides that, while his wife was giving birth an extraordinary thing had happened to him. He, the unbeliever, had begun to pray, and in the moment of praying he had believed. But that moment had passed, and he was unable to give any place in his life to the state of mind he had been in then. He could not admit that he had known the truth then and was now mistaken, because as soon as he began to think calmly about it, the whole thing fell to pieces. Nor could he admit that he had been mistaken then, because he cherished his state of soul of that time, and by admitting that it had been due to weakness he would have profaned those moments. He was in painful discord with himself and strained all the forces of his soul to get out of it. 9. These thoughts worried and tormented him now less, now more strongly, but they never left him. He read and pondered, and the more he read and pondered, the further he felt himself from the goal he was pursuing. Recently in Moscow and in the country, convinced that he would not find an answer in the materialists, he read, or read for the first time, Plato, and Spinoza, Kant, Schelling, Hegel and Schopenhauer, the philosophers who gave a non-materialistic explanation of life. 6. Their thoughts seemed fruitful to him when he was either reading or devising refutations of other teachings, especially that of the materialists, but as soon as he read or himself devised answers to the questions, one and the same thing always repeated itself, following the given definitions of vague words such as spirit, will, freedom, substance, deliberately falling into the verbal trap set for him by the philosophers or by himself. He seemed to begin to understand something, but he had only to forget the artificial train of thought and refer back from life itself to what had satisfied him while he thought along a given line, and suddenly the whole artificial edifice would collapse like a house of cards, and it would be clear that the edifice had been made of the same words rearranged, independent of something more important in life than reason. Once, reading Schopenhauer, he substituted love for his will. 7. And this new philosophy comforted him for a couple of days, until he stepped back from it, but it collapsed in the same way when he later looked at it from life, and turned out to be warmthless muslin clothing. His brother Sergei Ivanovich advised him to read the theological works of Khomyakov. 8. Levin read the second volume of Khomyakov's writings and, despite the elegant and witty polemical tone, which put him off at first, was struck by their teaching about the Church. He was struck first by the thought that it is not given to man to comprehend divine truths, but it is given to an aggregate of men united by love, the Church. He rejoiced at the thought of how much easier it was to believe in the presently existing, living Church, which constitutes the entire faith of men, which has God at its head and is therefore holy and infallible, and from it to receive one's beliefs about God, creation, the fall, redemption, than to begin with God, the distant, mysterious God, creation, and so on. But later, having read a history of the Church by a Catholic writer and a history of the Church by an Orthodox writer, and seeing that the two churches, infallible in their essence, rejected each other, he became disappointed in Khomyakov's teaching about the Church as well, and this edifice fell to dust just as the philosophical edifices had done. All that spring he was not himself and lived through terrible moments. Without knowing what I am and why I'm here, it is impossible for me to live. And I cannot know that, therefore I cannot live, Levin would say to himself. In infinite time, in the infinity of matter, in infinite space, a bubble organism separates itself, and that bubble holds out for a while and then bursts, and that bubble is me. This was a tormenting untruth, but it was the soul, the latest result of age-long labors of human thought in that direction. This was the latest belief on which all researches of the human mind in almost all fields were built. This was the reigning conviction, and out of all other explanations it was precisely this one that Levin, himself not knowing when or how, had involuntarily adopted as being at any rate the most clear. But it was not only untrue, it was the cruel mockery of some evil power, evil and offensive, which it was impossible to submit to. It was necessary to be delivered from this power. And deliverance was within everyone's reach. It was necessary to stop this dependence on evil. And there was one means, death. And, happy in his family life, a healthy man, Levin was several times so close to suicide that he hid a rope lest he hang himself with it, and was afraid to go about with a rifle lest he shoot himself. But Levin did not shoot himself or hang himself and went on living. 10. When Levin thought about what he was and what he lived for, he found no answer and fell into despair. But when he stopped asking himself about it, he seemed to know what he was and what he lived for, because he acted and lived firmly and definitely. Recently he had even lived much more firmly and definitely than before. Returning to the country in the middle of June, he also returned to his usual occupations, farming, relations with the muziks and his neighbors, running the household, his sisters' and brothers' affairs, which were in his hands, relations with his wife and family, cares about the baby, the new interest in bees he had acquired that last spring, took up all his time. These things occupied him, not because he justified them to himself by some general views as he had done formerly. On the contrary, now, disappointed by the failure of his earlier undertakings for the general good, on the one hand, and, on the other hand, too occupied with his thoughts and the very quantity of things that piled upon him from all sides, he completely abandoned all considerations of the common good, and these things occupied him only because it seemed to him that he had to do what he was doing, that he could not do otherwise. Formerly, it had begun almost from childhood and kept growing till full maturity. Whenever he had tried to do something that would be good for everyone, for mankind, for Russia, for the district, for the whole village, he had noticed that thinking about it was pleasant, but the doing itself was always awkward. There was no full assurance that the thing was absolutely necessary, and the doing itself, which at the start had seemed so big, kept diminishing and diminishing, dwindling to nothing, while now, after his marriage, when he began to limit himself more and more to living for himself, though he no longer experienced any joy at the thought of what he was doing, he felt certain that his work was necessary, saw that it turned out much better than before and that it was expanding more and more. Now, as if against his will, he cut deeper and deeper into the soil, like a plow, so that he could no longer get out without turning over the furrow. For the family to live as their fathers and grandfathers had been accustomed to live, that is, in the same cultural conditions and with the same upbringing of children, was undoubtedly necessary. It was as necessary as dinner when one was hungry. And just as for that it was necessary to prepare dinner, so it was necessary to run the farming mechanism of Pokrovsky in such a way as to produce income. As undoubtedly as it was necessary to pay debts, it was also necessary to maintain the family land in such condition that when his son inherited it he would thank his father, as Levin had thanked his grandfather for everything he had built and planted. And for that it was necessary not to lease the land, but to do the farming personally, to keep cattle, to manure the fields, to plant trees. It was as impossible not to take care of Sergei Ivanovitch's affairs, the affairs of his sister and of all the muzhiks who came for advice and were accustomed to do so, as it was impossible to drop a baby one is already holding in one's arms. It was necessary to see to the comfort of his invited sister-in-law and her children, and of his wife and baby, and it was impossible not to spend at least a small part of the day with them. All that, together with hunting and the new interest in bees, filled that entire life of Levin's which had no meaning for him when he thought. But besides the fact that Levin firmly knew what he had to do, he knew just as well how he had to do it all and which matter was more important than another. He knew that he had to hire workers as cheaply as possible, but that he should not put them in bondage by paying them in advance at a cheaper rate than they were worth, though it was very profitable. He could sell the muzhik straw when there was a shortage, though he felt sorry for them. But the inn and the pothouse, even though they brought income, had to be eliminated. For felling timber he had to punish them as severely as possible, but he could not fine them for cattle that strayed into his pastures, and though it upset the watchman and eliminated fear, it was impossible not to return the stray cattle. Pyotr, who was paying 10% a month to a money lender, had to be given a loan to redeem him. But it was impossible to let go or postpone the payment of quitrent for non-paying muzhiks. The steward could not be let off if a small meadow was left unmowed and the grass went to waste, yet he could not mow the 200 acres where a young forest had been planted. He could not excuse a worker who went home during a work period because his father had died, no matter how sorry he felt for him, and he had to pay him less for the costly months he missed. But it was impossible not to give monthly payments to old, useless household serfs. Levin also knew that, on returning home, he must first of all go to his wife, if she was unwell, and that the muzhiks who had been waiting for 3 hours could wait longer, and he knew that, despite all of the pleasure he experienced when hiving a swarm, he would have to give up that pleasure and let the old man hive the swarm without him, and go to talk with the peasants who had come looking for him at the apiary. Whether he was acting well or badly he did not know. And not only would not start proving it now but even avoided talking or thinking about it. Reasoning led him into doubt and kept him from seeing what he should and should not do. Yet when he did not think, but lived, he constantly felt in his soul the presence of an infallible judge who decided which of two possible actions was better and which was worse, and whenever he did not act as he should, he felt it at once. So he lived, not knowing and not seeing any possibility of knowing what he was and why he was living in the world, tormented by this ignorance to such a degree that he feared suicide, and at the same time firmly laying down his own particular, definite path in life. 11. The day Sergei Ivanovitch arrived at Pokrovsk was one of Levin's most tormenting days. It was the most pressing work time, when all the peasants show such an extraordinary effort of self-sacrifice in their labor as is not shown in any other conditions of life, and which would be highly valued if the people who show this quality valued it themselves, if it were not repeated every year, and if the results of this effort were not so simple. To mow and reap rye and oats and cart them, to mow out the meadows, to cross-plow the fallow land, to thresh the seed and sow the winter crops, it all seems simple and ordinary. But to manage to get it all done, it was necessary that all the village people, from oldest to youngest, work ceaselessly during those 3 or 4 weeks, 3 times more than usual, living on kvass, onions and black bread, threshing and transporting the sheaves by night and giving no more than 2 or 3 hours a day to sleep. And every year this was done all over Russia. Having lived the major part of his life in the country and in close relations with the peasantry, Levin always felt during the work period that this general peasant excitement communicated itself to him as well. In the morning he went to the first sowing of the rye, then to the oats, which he helped to cart and stack. Returning by the time his wife and sister-in-law got up, he had coffee with them and left on foot for the farmstead, where they had to start the newly set-up threshing machine for preparing the seed. That whole day, talking with the steward and the muzhiks, and at home talking with his wife, with Dolly, with her children, with his father-in-law, Levin thought about the one and only thing that occupied him during this time, apart from farm cares, and sought in everything a link to his questions, What am I? And where am I? And why am I here? Standing in the cool of the newly covered threshing barn, with fragrant leaves still clinging to the hazel rods pressed to the freshly peeled aspen rafters of the thatched roof, Levin gazed now through the open doorway in which the dry and bitter dust of the threshing hovered and sparkled, at the grass of the threshing floor lit by the hot sun and the fresh straw just taken from the barn, now at the white-breasted swallows with multicolored heads that flew peeping under the roof and, fluttering their wings, paused in the opening of the door, now at the people pottering about in the dark and dusty threshing barn, and thought strange thoughts. Why is all this being done? He thought. What am I standing here and making them work for? Why are they all bustling about and trying to show me their zeal? Why is this old woman toiling so? I know her, she's Matryona. I treated her when a beam fell on her during a fire, he thought, looking at a thin woman who, as she moved the grain with a rake, stepped tensely with her black and bare feet over the hard, uneven threshing floor. That time she recovered, but today or tomorrow or in 10 years they'll bury her and nothing will be left of her, nor of that saucy one in the red skirt who is beating the grain from the chaff with such a deft and tender movement. She'll be buried, too, and so will this piebald gelding, very soon, he thought, looking at the heavy-bellied horse, breathing rapidly through flared nostrils, that was treading the slanted wheel as it kept escaping from under him. He'll be buried, and Fyodor, the feeder, with his curly beard full of chaff and the shirt torn on his white shoulder, will also be buried. And now he's ripping the sheaves open, and giving orders, and yelling at the women, and straightening the belt on the flywheel with a quick movement, and above all, not only they, but I, too, will be buried and nothing will be left. What for? He thought then, and at the same time looked at his watch to calculate how much had been threshed in an hour. He had to know that in order to set the day's quota by it. It will soon be an hour, and they've only just started on the third stack, Levin thought, went over to the feeder and, shouting above the noise of the machine, told him to feed more slowly. You stuff in too much, Fyodor. See, it gets choked. That's why it's slow. Even it out. Blackened by the dust sticking to his sweaty face, Fyodor shouted something in reply, but went on doing it not as Levin wanted. Levin went up to the drum, motioned Fyodor aside, and began feeding himself. Working till the muzhik's dinner time, which was not far off, he left the threshing barn together with the feeder and got into conversation with him, stopping by a neat yellow brick of harvested rye stacked on the seed threshing floor. The feeder came from a distant village, the one where Levin used to lease land on collective principles. Now it was leased to an innkeeper. Levin got into conversation about that land with Fyodor and asked whether Platon, a wealthy and good muzhik from the same village, might rent it next year. The price is too dear, Platon wouldn't make enough. Konstantin Dmitrich, said the muzhik, picking ears of rye from under his sweaty shirt. Then how does Kirillov make it pay? Miduka, so the muzhik scornfully called the innkeeper, makes it pay right enough. Konstantin Dmitrich, he pushes till he gets his own. He takes no pity on a peasant. But Uncle Fokanich, so he called old Platon, he won't skin a man. He lends to you, he lets you off, so he comes out short. He's a man, too. But why should he let anyone off? Well, that's how it is. People are different. One man just lives for his own needs. Take Miduka even, just stuffs his belly. But Fokanich, he's an upright old man. He lives for the soul. He remembers God. How's that? Remembers God, lives for the soul? Levin almost shouted. Everybody knows how, by the truth, by God's way. People are different. Now, take you even, you wouldn't offend anybody either. Yes, yes, goodbye, said Levin, breathless with excitement, and, turning, he took his stick and quickly walked off towards home. A new, joyful feeling came over him. At the muzhik's words about Fokanich living for the soul, by the truth, by God's way, it was as if a host of vague but important thoughts burst from some locked-up place and, all rushing towards the same goal, whirled through his head, blinding him with their light. 12. Levin went in big strides along the main road, listening not so much to his thoughts, he still could not sort them out, as to the state of his soul, which he had never experienced before. The words spoken by the muzhik had the effect of an electric spark in his soul, suddenly transforming and uniting into one the whole swarm of disjointed, impotent, separate thoughts which had never ceased to occupy him. These thoughts, imperceptibly to himself, had occupied him all the while he had been talking about leasing the land. He felt something new in his soul and delightedly probed this new thing, not yet knowing what it was. To live not for one's own needs but for God. For what God? For God. And could anything more meaningless be said than what he said? He said one should not live for one's needs, that is, one should not live for what we understand, for what we're drawn to, for what we want, but for something incomprehensible, for God, whom no one can either comprehend or define. And what then? Didn't I understand those meaningless words of Fyodor's? And having understood, did I doubt their tightness? Did I find them stupid, vague, imprecise? No, I understood him, and in absolutely the same way that he understands, I understood fully and more clearly than I understand anything else in life, and never in my life have I doubted or could I doubt it. And not I alone, but everybody, the whole world, fully understands this one thing, and this one thing they do not doubt and always agree upon. Fyodor says that Kirill the innkeeper lives for his belly. That is clear and reasonable. None of us, as reasonable beings, can live otherwise than for our belly. And suddenly the same Fyodor says it's bad to live for the belly and that one should live for the truth, for God, and I understand him from a hint. And I and millions of people who lived ages ago and are living now, muziks, the poor in spirit, and the wise men who have thought and written about it, saying the same thing in their vague language, we're all agreed on this one thing, what we should live for and what is good. I and all people have only one firm, unquestionable and clear knowledge, and this knowledge cannot be explained by reason, it is outside it, and has no causes, and can have no consequences. If the good has a cause, it is no longer the good; if it has a consequence, a reward, it is also not the good. Therefore the good is outside the chain of cause and effect. And I know it, and we all know it. But I looked for miracles. I was sorry that I'd never seen a miracle that would convince me. And here it is, the only possible miracle, ever existing, surrounding me on all sides, and I never noticed it. What miracle can be greater than that? Is it possible that I've found the solution to everything? Is it possible that my sufferings are now over? Thought Levine, striding along the dusty road, noticing neither heat nor fatigue, and experiencing a feeling of relief after long suffering. This feeling was so joyful that it seemed incredible to him. He was breathless with excitement and, unable to walk any further, went off the road into the woods and sat down on the unmowed grass in the shade of the aspens. He took the hat from his sweaty head and lay down, propping himself on his elbow in the succulent, broad-bladed forest grass. Yes, I must collect myself and think it over, he thought, looking intently at the untrampled grass before him and following the movements of a little green bug that was climbing a stalk of couch grass and was blocked in its ascent by a leaf of angelica. From the very beginning, he said to himself, holding back the leaf of angelica so that it no longer hindered the bug in bending down some other plant so that the bug could get over onto it. What makes me so glad? What have I discovered? I used to say that in my body, in the body of this plant and of this bug, it didn't want to go over to that plant, it spread its wings and flew away. An exchange of matter takes place according to physical, chemical and physiological laws, and that in all of us, along with the aspens, and the clouds, and the nebulae, development goes on. Development out of what? Into what? An infinite development and struggle? As if there can be any direction or struggle in infinity. And I was astonished that in spite of the greatest efforts of my thinking along that line, the meaning of life, the meaning of my impulses and yearnings, was still not revealed to me. Yet the meaning of my impulses is so clear to me that I constantly live by it, and was amazed and glad when a muzik voiced it for me, to live for God, for the soul. I haven't discovered anything. I've only found out what I know. I've understood that power which not only gave me life in the past but is giving me life now. I am freed from deception. I have found the master. And he briefly repeated to himself the whole train of his thought during those last 2 years, the beginning of which was the clear, obvious thought of death at the sight of his beloved, hopelessly ill brother. Understanding clearly then for the first time that for every man and for himself nothing lay ahead but suffering, death and eternal oblivion, he decided that it was impossible to live that way, that he had either to explain his life so that it did not look like the wicked mockery of some devil, or shoot himself. But he had done neither the one nor the other, and had gone on living, thinking and feeling, and had even married at that same time and experienced much joy, and was happy whenever he did not think about the meaning of his life. What did it mean? It meant that his life was good, but his thinking was bad. He lived, without being aware of it, by those spiritual truths that he had drunken with his mother's milk, yet he thought not only without admitting those truths but carefully avoiding them. Now it was clear to him that he was able to live only thanks to the beliefs in which he had been brought up. What would I be and how would I live my life, if I did not have those beliefs, did not know that one should live for God and not for one's needs? I would rob, lie, kill. Nothing of what constitutes the main joys of my life would exist for me. And, making the greatest efforts of imagination, he was still unable to imagine the beastly being that he himself would be if he did not know what he lived for. I sought an answer to my question. But the answer to my question could not come from thought, which is incommensurable with the question. The answer was given by life itself, in my knowledge of what is good and what is bad. And I did not acquire that knowledge through anything. It was given to me as it is to everyone, given because I could not take it from anywhere. Where did I take it from? Was it through reason that I arrived at the necessity of loving my neighbor and not throttling him? I was told it as a child, and I joyfully believed it, because they told me what was in my soul. And who discovered it? Not reason. Reason discovered the struggle for existence and the law which demands that everyone who hinders the satisfaction of my desires should be throttled. That is the conclusion of reason. Reason could not discover love for the other, because it's unreasonable. Yes, pride, he said to himself, rolling over on his stomach and beginning to tie stalks of grass into a knot, trying not to break them. And not only the pride of reason, but the stupidity of reason. And, above all, the slyness, precisely the slyness, of reason. Precisely the swindling of reason, he repeated. 13. And Levin remembered a recent scene with Dolly and her children. The children, left alone, started roasting raspberries over the candles and squirting streams of milk into their mouths. Their mother, catching them at it, tried to impress upon them, in Levin's presence, how much work the things they destroyed had cost the grown-ups, and that this work had been done for them, and that if they started breaking cups they would have nothing to drink tea out of, and if they started spilling milk they would have nothing to eat and would die of hunger. And Levin was struck by the quiet, glum mistrust with which the children listened to their mother. They were merely upset that their amusing game had been stopped and did not believe a word of what she said to them. And they could not believe it, because they could not imagine the full scope of what they enjoyed and therefore could not imagine that they were destroying the very thing they lived by. That all goes without saying, they thought, and there's nothing interesting or important about it, because it has always been so and always will be. And it's always the same thing over and over. There's no point in us thinking about it, it's already made. We'd like to think up some new little thing of our own, so we thought up putting raspberries in a cup and roasting them over a candle, and squirting milk in streams straight into each other's mouths. It's fun and new and no worse than drinking from cups. Don't we do the same thing? Didn't I, when I saw the significance of the forces of nature and the meaning of human life with reason? He went on thinking. And don't all philosophical theories do the same thing, leading man by a way of thought that is strange and unnatural to him to the knowledge of what he has long known and known so certainly that without it he would not even be able to live? Is it not seen clearly in the development of each philosopher's theory that he knows beforehand, as unquestionably as the muzhik Fyodor, and know it more clearly than he, the chief meaning of life, and only wants to return by a dubious mental path to what everybody knows? Go on, leave the children alone to provide for themselves, to make the dishes, do the milking and so on. Would they start playing pranks? They'd starve to death. Go on, leave us to ourselves, with our passions and thoughts, with no notion of one God and Creator, or with no notion of what the good is, with no explanation of moral evil. Go on, try building something without those notions. We destroy only because we're spiritually sated. Exactly like children. Where do I get the joyful knowledge I have in common with the muzhik, which alone gives me peace of mind? Where did I take it from? Having been brought up with the notion of God, as a Christian, having filled my whole life with the spiritual blessings that Christianity gave me, filled with those blessings myself and living by them, but, like the children, not understanding them, I destroy, that is, want to destroy, what I live by. And as soon as an important moment comes in my life, like children who are cold and hungry, I go to him, and even less than children scolded by their mother for their childish pranks do I feel that my childish refusal to let well enough alone is not to my credit. Yes, what I know, I do not know by reason, it is given to me, it is revealed to me, and I know it by my heart, by faith in that main thing that the Church confesses. The Church? The Church, Levin repeated, turned over on his other side and, leaning on his elbow, began looking into the distance, at the herd coming down to the river on the other bank. But can I believe in everything the Church confesses? He thought, testing himself and thinking up everything that might destroy his present peace. He began purposely to recall all the teachings of the Church that had always seemed to him the most strange and full of temptation. Creation, and how do I account for existence? By existence, by nothing, the devil and sin. And how am I to explain evil? The Redeemer. But I know nothing, and can know nothing but what I've been told along with everybody else. And it now seemed to him that there was not a single belief of the Church that violated the main thing, faith in God, in the good, as the sole purpose of man. In place of each of the Church's beliefs there could be put the belief in serving the good instead of one's needs. And each of them not only did not violate it but was indispensable for the accomplishment of the chief miracle, constantly manifested on earth, which consists in it being possible for each person, along with millions of the most diverse people, sages and holy fools, children and old men, along with everyone, with some peasant, with Lvov, with Kitty, with beggars and kings, to understand one and the same thing with certainty and to compose that life of the soul which alone makes life worth living and alone is what we value. Lying on his back, he was now looking at the high, cloudless sky. Don't I know that it is infinite space and not a round vault? But no matter how I squint and strain my sight, I cannot help seeing it as round and limited, and despite my knowledge of infinite space, I am undoubtedly right when I see a firm blue vault, more right than when I strain to see beyond it. Levin had stopped thinking and was as if only listening to the mysterious voices that spoke joyfully and anxiously about something among themselves. Can this be faith? He wondered, afraid to believe his happiness. My God, thank you, he said, choking back the rising sobs and with both hands wiping away the tears that filled his eyes. 14. Levin looked before him and saw the herd, then he saw his own little gig with Raven harnessed to it, and the coachman, who drove up to the herd and said something to the herdsman. Then, already close to him, he heard the sound of wheels and the snorting of the sleek horse, but he was so absorbed in his thoughts that he did not even think why the coachman was coming to him. He remembered it only when the coachman, having driven up quite close to him, called out, "The mistress sent me. Your brother has come and some other gentleman with him." Levin got into the gig and took the reins. As if roused from the sleep, Levin took a long time coming to his senses. He looked at the sleek horse, lathered between the thighs and on the neck where a strap rubbed it, looked at the coachman, Ivan, who was sitting beside him, and remembered that he had been expecting his brother, that his wife was probably worried by his long absence, and tried to guess who the visitor was who had come with his brother. He now pictured his brother, and his wife, and the unknown visitor differently than before. It seemed to him that his relations with all people would now be different. With my brother now there won't be that estrangement there has always been between us, there won't be any arguments. With Kitty there will be no more quarrels. With the visitor, whoever he is, I'll be gentle and kind, and with the servants, with Ivan, everything will be different. Keeping a tight rein on the good horse, who was snorting with impatience and begging to run free, Levin kept looking at Ivan, who sat beside him not knowing what to do with his idle hands and constantly smoothing down his shirt, and sought a pretext for starting a conversation with him. He wanted to say that Ivan should not have tightened the girth so much, but that seemed like a reproach and he wanted to have a loving conversation. Yet nothing else came to his mind. "Please bear to the right, sir, there's a stump," said the coachman, guiding Levin by the reins. "Kindly do not touch me and do not instruct me," said Levin, vexed by this interference from the coachman. This interference vexed him just as it always had, and at once he sadly felt how mistaken he had been in supposing that his inner state could instantly change him in his contacts with reality. About a quarter of a mile from home, Levin saw Grisha and Tanya running to meet him. "Uncle Kostya, Mom is coming, and Grandpapa, and Sergei Ivanitch, and somebody else," they said, climbing into the gig. "Who is it?" "He's terribly scary. And he goes like this with his arms," said Tanya, standing up in the gig and imitating Katovisov. "But is he old or young?" Levin asked, laughing, reminded of someone by Tanya's imitation. "Ah," he thought, "I only hope it's not somebody unpleasant." Only when he turned round the bend of the road and saw them coming to meet him did Levin recognize Katovisov in his straw hat, walking along waving his arms just as Tanya had imitated him. Katovisov was very fond of talking about philosophy, taking his notion of it from natural scientists who never studied philosophy, and in Moscow recently Levin had had many arguments with him. One of those conversations, in which Katovisov had thought he had gained the upper hand, was the first thing that Levin remembered when he recognized him. "No, I'm not going to argue and speak my thoughts light-mindedly, not for anything," he thought. Getting down from the gig and greeting his brother and Katovisov, Levin asked about his wife. "She's taken Mitya to khodʔrʔe, that was a wood near the house. She wanted to settle him there. It's hot in the house," said Dolly. Levin had always advised his wife against taking the baby to the wood, which he considered dangerous, and the news displeased him. "She rushes from place to place with him," the prince said, smiling. "I advised her to try taking him to the ice cellar. She wanted to go to the apiary. She thought you were there." "That's where we're going," said Dolly. "Well, what are you up to?" said Sergei Ivanovich, lagging behind the others and walking side by side with his brother. "Nothing special. Busy with farming, as usual," Levin answered. "And you, can you stay long?" "We've been expecting you all this while." "A couple of weeks. There's so much to do in Moscow." At these words the brothers' eyes met, and Levin, despite his usual and now especially strong desire to be on friendly and, above all, simple terms with his brother, felt it awkward to look at him. He lowered his eyes and did not know what to say. Going over subjects of conversation that would be agreeable for Sergei Ivanovich and would distract him from talking about the Serbian war and the Slavic question, which he had hinted at in mentioning how busy he was in Moscow, Levin spoke of Sergei Ivanovich's book. "Well, have there been reviews of your book?" he asked. Sergei Ivanovich smiled at the deliberateness of the question. "Nobody's interested in it, and I least of all," he said. "Look, Darya Alexandrovna, it's going to rain," he added, pointing with his umbrella at some white clouds that appeared over the aspen tops. And these words were enough to re-establish between the brothers the not hostile but cool relations that Levin was trying to avoid. Levin went over to Katovisov. "How nice that you decided to come," he said to him. "I've long been meaning to. Now we'll talk and see." "Have you read Spencer?" "No, I didn't finish," Levin said. "However, I don't need him now." "How so?" "That's interesting." "Why?" "I mean I've finally become convinced that I won't find in him and those like him the solution to the questions that interest me." Now, but he was suddenly struck by the calm and cheerful expression on Katovisov's face, and was so sorry to have disturbed his own mood with this conversation, as he obviously had, that, recalling his intention, he stopped. "However, we'll talk later," he added. "If we're going to the apiary, it's here, down this path," he said, addressing everyone. Having come by a narrow path to an unmowed clearing, covered on one side with bright cowwheat thickly interspersed with tall, dark green clumps of hellebore, Levin placed his guests in the dense, fresh shade of the young aspens, on a bench and on stumps especially prepared for visitors to the apiary who were afraid of bees, and went to the enclosure to fetch bread, cucumbers, and fresh honey for the children and grown-ups. Trying to make as few quick movements as possible and listening to the bees flying past him more and more frequently, he went down the path as far as the cottage. Just at the front door a bee whined, tangled in his beard, but he carefully freed it. Going into the shady front hall, he took down his net that hung from a peg in the wall, put it on, and, hands in pockets, went out to the fenced apiary where, in the middle of a mowed space, in even rows, tied to stakes with strips of bast, the old hives stood, all of them familiar to him, each with its own story, and, along the wattle fence, the young ones started that year. Bees and drones played, dizzying the eye, before the flight holes, circling and swarming in one spot, and among them the worker bees flew, all in the same direction, out to the blossoming lintons in the forest and back to the hives with their booty. His ears were ceaselessly filled with various sounds, now of a busy worker bee flying quickly by, now of a trumpeting, idle drone, now of alarmed, sting-ready sentry bees guarding their property against the enemy. On the other side of the fence, the old man was shaving a hoop and did not see Levin. Levin stopped in the middle of the apiary without calling to him. He was glad of the chance to be alone, in order to recover from reality, which had already brought his mood down so much. He remembered that he had already managed to get angry with Ivan, to show coldness to his brother, and to talk light-mindedly with Ktovesov. Can it have been only a momentary mood that will pass without leaving a trace? He thought. But in that same moment, returning to his mood, he felt with joy that something new and important had taken place in him. Reality had only veiled for a time the inner peace he had found, but it was intact within him. Just as the bees now circling around him, threatening and distracting him, deprived him of full physical ease, made him shrink to avoid them, so the cares that had surrounded him from the moment he got into the gig had deprived him of inner freedom, but that lasted only as long as he was among them. As his bodily strength was wholly intact in him, despite the bees, so, too, was his newly realized spiritual strength intact. 15. And do you know, Kostya, whom Sergei Ivanovitch traveled with on the way here? Dolly asked, after distributing the cucumbers and honey among the children. Vronsky. He's going to Serbia. And not alone, he's taking a squadron at his own expense, said Ktovesov. That suits him well, said Levin. And are the volunteers still going? He added, glancing at Sergei Ivanovitch. Sergei Ivanovitch, without replying, was carefully probing with a blunt knife in the bowl, where a square of white honeycomb lay, for a still living bee stuck in the liquid honey. And how they are. You should have seen what went on at the station yesterday, said Ktovesov, noisily crunching on a cucumber. Well, how are we to understand that? For Christ's sake, Sergei Ivanovitch, explain to me where all these volunteers go. Who are they fighting? Asked the old prince, evidently continuing a conversation started without Levin. The Turks, Sergei Ivanovitch replied with a calm smile, having liberated the bee, dark with honey and helplessly waving its legs, and transferred it from the knife to a sturdy aspen leaf. But who declared war on the Turks? Ivan Ivanitch Rigazov and Countess Lydia Ivanovna, along with Madame Stahl? No one declared war, but people sympathize with the suffering of their neighbors and want to help them, said Sergei Ivanovitch. But the prince is not talking about help, said Levin, interceding for his father-in-law, but about war. The prince is saying that private persons cannot take part in a war without the permission of the government. Kostya, look, it's a bee. We'll really get stung, said Dolly, waving away a wasp. It's not a bee, it's a wasp, said Levin. Well, sir, what's your theory? Ktovesov said to Levin with a smile, obviously challenging him to an argument. Why do private persons not have the right? My theory is this. On the one hand, war is such a beastly, cruel and terrible thing that no man, to say nothing of a Christian, can personally take upon himself the responsibility for starting a war. That can only be done by a government, which is called to it and is inevitably drawn into war. On the other hand, according to both science and common sense, in state matters, especially the matter of war, citizens renounce their personal will. Sergei Ivanovitch and Ktovesov began talking simultaneously with ready-made objections. That's the hitch, my dear, that there may be occasions when the government does not carry out the will of the citizens, and then society declares its will, said Ktovesov. But Sergei Ivanovitch obviously did not approve of this objection. He frowned at Ktovesov's words and said something different. The question shouldn't be put that way. There is no declaration of war here, but simply the expression of human, Christian feeling. They're killing our brothers, of the same blood, of the same religion. Well, suppose they weren't even our brothers, our co-religionists, but simply children, women, old men. Indignation is aroused, and the Russian people run to help stop these horrors. Imagine yourself going down the street and seeing some drunk beating a woman or a child. I don't think you'd start asking whether war had or had not been declared on the man, but would fall upon him and protect the victim. But I wouldn't kill him, said Levin. Yes, you would. I don't know. If I saw it, I would yield to my immediate feeling, but I can't say beforehand. And there is not and cannot be such an immediate feeling about the oppression of the Slavs. Maybe not for you, but for others there is, said Sergei Ivanovitch, with a frown of displeasure. There are stories alive among the people about Orthodox Christians suffering under the yoke of the infidel Huguenots. 9. The people heard about their brothers suffering and spoke out. Maybe so, Levin said evasively, but I don't see it. I'm the people myself, and I don't feel it. Neither do I, said the prince. I was living abroad and reading the newspapers, and I confess, before the Bulgarian atrocities I simply couldn't understand why the Russians all suddenly loved their brother Slavs so much, while I felt no love for them. I was very upset, thought I was a monster, or that Carlsbad affected me that way. But I came here and was reassured. I see there are people interested just in Russia and not in our brother Slavs. Constantine for one. Personal opinions mean nothing here, said Sergei Ivanovich. It's no matter of personal opinions when all Russia, the people, has expressed its will. Forgive me. I just don't see that. The people know nothing about it, said the prince. No, Papa, how could they not? What about Sunday in church? Said Dolly, who was listening to the conversation. Give me a napkin, please, she said to the old man, who was looking at the children with a smile. It can't be that everybody. And what about Sunday in church? The priest was told to read it. He read it. They understood nothing, sighed, as they do at every sermon. The prince went on. Then they were told the church would take up a collection for a charitable cause, and so they each got out a kopeck and gave. But for what? They themselves didn't know. The people cannot help knowing. A consciousness of their destiny always exists among the people, and in such moments as the present it becomes clear to them, Sergei Ivanovich said, glancing at the old beekeeper. The handsome old man with streaks of gray in his black beard and thick silver hair stood motionless, holding a bowl of honey, looking down gently and calmly from his height upon the masters, obviously neither understanding nor wishing to understand anything. That's quite so, he said to Sergei Ivanovich's words, shaking his head significantly. There, just ask him. He doesn't know or think anything, said Levin. Have you heard about the war, Mikhailich? He turned to him. What they read about in church? What do you think? Should we go to war for the Christians? What's there for us to think? Alexander Nikolaevich, the emperor, has thought on us, and he'll think on us in everything. He knows better. Shall I bring more bread for the lad? He asked Darya Alexandrovna, pointing to Grisha, who was finishing the crust. I have no need to ask, said Sergei Ivanovich. We have seen and still see how hundreds and hundreds of people, abandoning everything to serve a just cause, come from all ends of Russia and directly and clearly state their thought and aim. They bring their kopecks or go themselves and directly say why. What does that mean? In my opinion, said Levin, beginning to get excited, it means that, among 80 million people, there are always to be found, not hundreds like now, but tens of thousands of people who have lost their social position, reckless people, who are always ready to join Pugachev's band, to go to Kyiv, to Serbia. 10. I tell you, they are not hundreds and not reckless people, but the best representatives of the nation, said Sergei Ivanovich, with such irritation as if he were defending his last possession. And the donations? Here the whole people directly expresses its will. This word people is so vague, said Levin. District clerks, teachers, and maybe one muzhik in 1,000 know what it's about. And the remaining 80 million, like Mikhailich, not only don't express their will, but don't have the slightest notion what they should express their will about. What right then do we have to say it's the will of the people? 16. Experienced in dialectics, Sergei Ivanovich, without objecting, at once shifted the conversation to a different area. Yes, if you want to learn the spirit of the people in an arithmetical way, that is certainly very difficult to achieve. Voting has not been introduced among us, and it cannot be introduced, because it does not express the will of the people. But there are other ways of doing it. It is felt in the air, it is felt in the heart. Not to mention those undercurrents that have stirred up the stagnancy of the people and are clear to any unprejudiced person. Look at society in the narrow sense. All the most diverse parties in the world of the intelligentsia, so hostile before, have merged into one. All discord has ended, all social organs are saying one and the same thing. Everyone has felt the elemental power that has caught them up and is carrying them in one direction. It's the newspapers that all say the same thing, said the prince. That's true. And it's so much the same that it's like frogs before a thunderstorm. You can't hear anything on account of them. Frogs or no frogs, I don't publish the newspapers and don't want to defend them. I'm talking about the one-mindedness of the world of the intelligentsia, said Sergei Ivanovich, turning to his brother. Levin was about to reply, but the old prince interrupted him. Well, about this one-mindedness something else might be said, he observed. There's this dear son-in-law of mine, Stepan Arkadyevich, you know him. He's now getting a post as member of the committee of the commission and whatever else, I don't remember. Only there's nothing to do there. What, Dolly, it's not a secret. And the salary's 8,000. Try asking him whether his work is useful and he'll prove to you that it's very much needed. And he's a truthful man. But then it's impossible not to believe in the usefulness of 8,000. Yes, he asked me to tell Darya Alexandrovna that he got the post, Sergei Ivanovich said with displeasure, thinking that the prince had spoken beside the point. And it's the same with the one-mindedness of the newspapers. It's been explained to me, as soon as there's a war, their income doubles. How can they not think that the destiny of the people and the Slavs, and all the rest of it? There are many newspapers I don't like, but that is unfair, said Sergei Ivanovich. I would make just one condition, the prince went on. Alphonse Karr put it splendidly before the war with Prussia. 11. You think war is necessary? Fine. Send anyone who preaches war to a special front-line legion, into the assault, into the attack, ahead of everyone. The editors would be a fine sight, Katovisov said with a loud laugh, picturing to himself the editors he knew in this select legion. Why, they'd run away, said Dolly, they'd just be a hindrance. If they run, get them from behind with canister shot or Cossacks with whips, said the prince. That's a joke. And not a very nice joke, if you'll forgive me, Prince, said Sergei Ivanovich. I don't see it as a joke, it's... Levin began, but Sergei Ivanovich interrupted him. Each member of society is called upon to do what is proper to him, he said. Thinking people do their work by expressing public opinion. And the unanimity and full expression of public opinion is the merit of the press, and at the same time a joyous fact. 20 years ago we would have been silent. But now we hear the voice of the Russian people, ready to rise as one man and sacrifice themselves for their oppressed brothers. That is a great step and a pledge of strength. But it's not just to sacrifice themselves, it's also to kill Turks, Levin said timidly. The people sacrifice and are always prepared to sacrifice themselves for their soul, not for murder, he added, involuntarily connecting the conversation with the thoughts that occupied him so much. How? For the soul? You understand that for a natural scientist that is a troublesome expression. What is this soul? Katovisov said, smiling. Ah, you know. By God, I haven't the slightest idea. Katovisov said with a loud laugh. I have brought not peace but a sword, says Christ. 12. Sergei Ivanovich objected on his side, simply quoting, as if it were the most understandable thing, the very passage of the Gospel that had always disturbed Levin most of all. That's quite so, the old man, who was standing near them, again repeated, responding to the accidental glance cast at him. No, my dear, you're demolished, completely demolished. Katovisov cried merrily. Levin flushed with vexation, not because he was demolished, but because he had not restrained himself and had begun to argue. No, I can't argue with them, he thought, they're wearing impenetrable armor. And I am naked. He saw that his brother and Katovisov were not to be persuaded, and still less did he find it possible for himself to agree with them. What they preached was that very pride of reason which had nearly ruined him. He could not agree with the idea that dozens of people, his brother among them, had the right, on the basis of what was told them by some hundreds of fine-talking volunteers coming to the capitals, to say that they and the newspapers expressed the will and thought of the people. A thought that expressed itself in revenge and murder. He could not agree with it, because he did not see the expression of these thoughts in the people among whom he lived, nor did he find these thoughts in himself, and he could not consider himself anything else but one of those persons who made up the Russian people, and above all because, while neither he nor the people knew or could know what the common good consisted in, he knew firmly that it was only possible to attain that common good by strictly fulfilling the law of the good that was open to every man, and therefore he could not desire war and preach it for any common purposes whatsoever. He said, together with Mikhailych and the people, who expressed their thought in the legend about the calling of the Vrangians. 13. Be our princes and rule over us. We joyfully promise full obedience. All labors, all humiliations, all sacrifices we take upon ourselves. But we will not judge or decide. And now, according to Sergei Ivanovitch's words, the people had renounced this right purchased at so dear a cost. He also wanted to say that if public opinion is an infallible judge, then why was a revolution or a commune not as legitimate as the movement in defense of the Slavs? But these were all thoughts that could not decide anything. Only one thing could unquestionably be seen, that in that present moment the argument irritated Sergei Ivanovitch and therefore it was bad to argue, and Levin fell silent and drew his visitor's attention to the fact that clouds were gathering and that they had better go home before it rained. 17. The prince and Sergei Ivanovitch got into the gig and drove. The rest of the company, quickening their pace, went home on foot. But the storm clouds, now white, now black, came on so quickly that they had to walk still faster to get home ahead of the rain. The advancing clouds, low and dark as sooty smoke, raced across the sky with extraordinary speed. They were still about 200 paces from the house, but the wind had already risen, and a downpour could be expected at any moment. The children ran ahead with frightened, joyful shrieks. Darya Alexandrovna, struggling hard with the skirts that clung to her legs, no longer walked but ran, not taking her eyes off the children. The men, holding on to their hats, walked with long strides. They were just at the porch when a big drop struck and broke up on the edge of the iron gutter. The children, and the grown-ups after them, ran under the cover of the roof with merry chatter. "Katerina Alexandrovna?" Levin asked Agafia Mikhailovna, who met them in the front hall with cloaks and wraps. "We thought she was with you." "And Mitya?" "They must be in Kolock, and the nannies with them." Levin seized the wraps and ran to Kolock. During that short period of time the center of the cloud had covered the sun so that it became as dark as during a solar eclipse. The stubborn wind, as if insisting on its own, kept stopping Levin and, tearing off leaves and linden blossoms and bearing the white birch boughs in an ugly and strange way, bent everything in one direction: acacias, flowers, burdock, grass and treetops. Farm girls who had been working in the garden ran squealing under the roof of the servants' quarters. The white curtain of pouring rain had already invaded all the distant forest and half a nearby field and was moving quickly towards Kolock. The dampness of rain breaking up into fine drops filled the air. Lowering his head and struggling against the wind, which tore the shawls from his arms, Levin was already running up to Kolock and could see something white showing beyond an oak, when suddenly everything blazed. The whole earth caught fire and the vault of the sky seemed to crack overhead. Opening his dazzled eyes and peering through the thick curtain of rain that now separated him from Kolock, Levin first saw with horror the strangely altered position of the familiar oak's green crown in the middle of the wood. Can it have snapped off? Levin barely managed to think, when, moving more and more quickly, the oak's crown disappeared behind the other trees, and he heard the crash of a big tree falling. The flash of the lightning, the sound of the thunder, and the feeling of his body being instantly doused with cold, merged in Levin into one impression of horror. My God, not on them," he said. And though he immediately thought how senseless his request was that they should not be killed by an oak that had already fallen, he repeated it, knowing that he could do nothing better than this senseless prayer. He ran to the spot where they usually went, but did not find them there. They were at the other end of the wood, under an old linden, and calling to him. Two figures in dark dresses, they were actually light, stood bending over something. They were Kitty and the nanny. The rain was already letting up and it was growing lighter as Levin raced towards them. The lower part of the nanny's dress was dry, but Kitty's dress was soaked through and clung to her body all over. Though it was no longer raining, they went on standing in the same position they had assumed when the storm broke, bent over the carriage, holding a green umbrella. "Alive? Safe? Thank God," he said, splashing through the puddles in his flopping, water-filled shoes, and running up to them. Kitty's rosy and wet face was turned to him and smiled timidly from under her now shapeless hat. "Well, aren't you ashamed? I don't understand how you can be so imprudent." He fell upon his wife in vexation. "I swear it's not my fault. I was just going to leave when he began acting up. We had to change him. We just..." Kitty began excusing herself. Mitya was safe, dry, and had slept through it all. "Well, Thank God. I don't know what I'm saying. They gathered up the wet napkins. The nanny took the baby out and carried him. Levin walked beside his wife and, guilty on account of his vexation, squeezed her hand in secret from the nanny. 18. Throughout the day, during the most varied conversations, in which he took part as if only with the external part of his mind, Levin, despite his disappointment in the change that was supposed to take place in him, never ceased joyfully sensing the fullness of his heart. After the rain it was too wet to go for a walk. Besides, the storm clouds never left the horizon and, now here, now there, passed thundering and black across the edges of the sky. The whole company spent the rest of the day at home. No more arguments started, and, on the contrary, after dinner everyone was in the best of spirits. Ktovsov first made the ladies laugh with his original jokes, which people always liked so much on first making his acquaintance, but then, prompted by Sergei Ivanovitch, he told them his very interesting observations on the differences of character and even of physiognomy between female and male houseflies and on their life. Sergei Ivanovitch was also merry and over tea, prompted by his brother, expounded his view of the future of the Eastern question. 14. So simply and well that everyone listened with delight. Only Kitty could not listen to the end. She was called to bathe Mitya. A few minutes after Kitty had left, Levin, too, was called to her in the nursery. Leaving his tea, and also regretting the interruption of the interesting conversation, and at the same time worrying about why he had been called, since that happened only on important occasions, Levin went to the nursery. In spite of his great interest in Sergei Ivanovitch's plan, something completely new to him and which he had not heard to the end, for how the liberated 40 millions of the Slavic world, together with Russia, were to start a new epoch in history, and in spite of his curiosity and alarm about why he had been called, as soon as he left the drawing room and was alone he at once remembered his morning thoughts. And all those considerations about the meaning of the Slavic element in world history seemed so insignificant to him compared with what was happening in his soul that he instantly forgot it all and was transported into the same mood he had been in that morning. He did not recall his whole train of thought now, as he had done before. He did not need to. He was immediately transported into the feeling that guided him, which was connected with those thoughts, and he found that feeling still stronger and more definite in his soul than before. What had happened to him before, when he had invented some reassurance and had had to restore the whole train of thought in order to recover the feeling, did not happen now. On the contrary, now the feeling of joy and reassurance was all the more alive, and his thought could not keep up with it. He walked across the terrace and looked at 2 stars appearing in the already darkening sky, and suddenly remembered, yes, when I was looking at the sky and thinking that the vault I see is not an untruth, there was something I didn't think through, something I hid from myself, he thought. But whatever it was, there can be no objection. I only have to think and everything will be explained. As he was going into the nursery, he remembered what he had hidden from himself. It was that if the main proof of the deity is his revelation of what is good, then why was this revelation limited to the Christian Church alone? What relation did the beliefs of the Buddhists, the Mohammedans, who also confess and do good, have to that revelation? It seemed to him that he had the answer to that question, but before he had time to formulate it for himself, he was already in the nursery. Kitty was standing with her sleeves rolled up beside the tub with the baby splashing in it and, hearing her husband's steps, turned her face to him and called him with her smile. With one hand she supported the head of the plump baby, who was floating on his back, his little legs squirming, and with the other, smoothly tensing her muscles, she squeezed out a sponge over him. Look here," she said, when her husband came up to her. "Agafia Mikhailovna's right. He recognizes us." The thing was that Mitya, that day, obviously, unquestionably, had begun to recognize all his own people. As soon as Levin came up to the bath, an experiment was performed for him, and it succeeded perfectly. The scullery maid, invited for the purpose, took Kitty's place and bent over the baby. He frowned and wagged his head negatively. Kitty bent over him and he lit up with a smile, put his hands to the sponge and bubbled with his lips, producing such a pleased and strange sound that not only Kitty and the nanny but Levin, too, went into unexpected raptures. The baby was taken out of the tub with one hand, doused with water, wrapped in a sheet, dried off and, after a piercing shout, handed to his mother. "Well, "I'm glad you're beginning to love him," Kitty said to her husband, after settling calmly in her usual place with the baby at her breast. "I'm very glad, because it was beginning to upset me." "You said you felt nothing for him." "No, did I say I felt nothing? I only said I was disappointed." "What? Disappointed in him?" "Not in him but in my own feeling. I expected more. I expected that a new, pleasant feeling would blossom in me like a surprise. And suddenly, instead of that, there was squeamishness, pity." She listened to him attentively over the baby, replacing on her slender fingers the rings she had taken off in order to wash Mitya. "And, above all, there's much more fear and pity than pleasure. Today, after that fear during the thunderstorm, I realized how much I love him." Kitty smiled radiantly. "Were you very frightened?" she said. "I was, too, but I'm more afraid now that it's past. I'll go and look at the oak. And how nice ktože is. And generally the whole day was so pleasant. And you're so good with Sergei Ivanovich when you want to be. Well, go to them. It's always so hot and steamy here after the bath." 19. Leaving the nursery and finding himself alone, Levin at once remembered that thought in which there was something unclear. Instead of going to the drawing room, where voices could be heard, he stopped on the terrace and, leaning on the rail, began looking at the sky. It was already quite dark, and in the south, where he was looking, there were no clouds. The clouds stood on the opposite side. From there came flashes of lightning and the roll of distant thunder. Levin listened to the drops monotonously dripping from the lintens in the garden and looked at the familiar triangle of stars and the branching Milky Way passing through it. At each flash of lightning not only the Milky Way but the bright stars also disappeared. But as soon as the lightning died out they reappeared in the same places, as if thrown by some unerring hand. "Well, what is it that disturbs me?" Levin said to himself, feeling beforehand that the resolution of his doubts, though he did not know it yet, was already prepared in his soul. Yes, the one obvious, unquestionable manifestation of the deity is the laws of the good disclosed to the world by revelation, which I feel in myself, and by acknowledging which I do not so much unite myself as I am united, whether I will or no, with others in one community of believers which is called the Church. Well, but the Jews, the Mohammedans, the Confucians, the Buddhists, what are they? He asked himself the same question that had seemed dangerous to him. Can these hundreds of millions of people be deprived of the highest good, without which life has no meaning? He pondered, but at once corrected himself. "What am I asking?" he said to himself. "I'm asking about their relation to the deity of all the various faiths of mankind. I'm asking about the general manifestation of God to the whole world with all these nebulae. What am I doing? To me personally, to my heart, unquestionable knowledge is revealed, inconceivable to reason, and I stubbornly want to express this knowledge by means of reason and words. Don't I know that the stars don't move?" he asked himself, looking at a bright planet that had already changed its position over the topmost branch of a birch. "Yet, looking at the movement of the stars, I cannot picture to myself the turning of the earth, and I'm right in saying that the stars move. And would the astronomers be able to understand or calculate anything, if they took into account all of the various complex movements of the earth? All their astonishing conclusions about the distances, weights, movements and disturbances of the heavenly bodies are based solely on the visible movement of the luminaries around the fixed earth, on that very movement which is now before me, which has been that way for millions of people throughout the ages, and has been and will always be the same and can always be verified. And just as the conclusions of astronomers that were not based on observations of the visible sky in relation to the same meridian and the same horizon would be idle and lame, so my conclusions would be idle and lame if they were not based on that understanding of the good which always has been and will be the same for everyone, and which is revealed to me by Christianity and can always be verified in my soul. And I don't have the right or possibility of resolving the question of other beliefs and their attitude to the deity." "Ah, you haven't gone?" the voice of Kitty suddenly said. She was walking the same way towards the drawing room. "What, are you upset about something?" she said, studying his face attentively by the light of the stars. But she would still have been unable to see his face if lightning, again hiding the stars, had not lit it up. By its light she made out his face and, seeing that he was calm and joyful, she smiled at him. "She understands," he thought. "She knows what I'm thinking about. Shall I tell her or not?" "Yes, I'll tell her. But just as he was about to begin speaking, she also started to speak. Listen, Kostya, do me a favor, she said. Go to the corner room and see how they've arranged everything for Sergei Ivanovich. I'm embarrassed too. Did they put in the new washstand? Very well, I'll make sure, said Levin, getting up and kissing her. No, I won't tell her, he thought, as she walked on ahead of him. It's a secret that's necessary and important for me alone and inexpressible in words. This new feeling hasn't changed me, hasn't made me happy or suddenly enlightened, as I dreamed, just like the feeling for my son. Nor was there any surprise. And faith or not faith, I don't know what it is, but this feeling has entered into me just as imperceptibly through suffering and has firmly lodged itself in my soul. I'll get angry in the same way with the coachman Ivan, argue in the same way, speak my mind inappropriately. There will be the same wall between my soul's holy of holies and other people, even my wife. I'll accuse her in the same way of my own fear and then regret it. I'll fail in the same way to understand with my reason why I pray, and yet I will pray. But my life now, my whole life, regardless of all that may happen to me, every minute of it, is not only not meaningless, as it was before, but has the unquestionable meaning of the good which it is in my power to put into it. The end.